Tonight we step into a story that unfolds not in the grand palaces of European kings, where courtiers whispered and schemed for power, or in the monastery libraries, where monks copied ancient texts by candlelight, but rather on a sun-scorched stretch of Palestinian earth, where mathematics and faith were about to collide in ways that would reshape the balance of power between two civilizations locked in a struggle for control of lands, both considered holy beyond measure. The year is 1177, and if you could transport yourself back to that pivotal moment in history, you would find yourself standing with 500 exhausted knights whose armor was caked with the dust of forced marches, your horses foaming at the mouth after a brutal journey that should have killed half of them before they ever reached the battlefield where their fate would be decided. The November sun beats down unnaturally hot for late autumn in a land where seasons could be unpredictable, turning your armor into a personal furnace that slowly cooked the flesh beneath despite all efforts to find relief from the oppressive heat. Your scouts have just returned from their reconnaissance mission with news that makes even grown men who have seen years of combat weep openly without shame. Not 20,000 enemies, as you had feared when the reports first came in from frontier watchers. 26,000 of Islam's finest warriors spread across the horizon like a plague of locusts descending upon fields of grain, their banners and standards stretching as far as the eye could see in every direction. That is 52 enemies for every one of your brothers in arms standing beside you. The mathematics of annihilation are simple and brutal and final in their cold logic that admits no hope. Yet, in just 2 hours from this moment of apparent doom, 20,000 of those warriors will be dead on the field, their blood soaking into the thirsty earth. The most powerful Muslim army assembled since the First Crusade began decades earlier will cease to exist as an effective fighting force capable of threatening Christian positions. A dying teenage boy with bandaged hands wrapped in silk to prevent his diseased flesh from literally falling apart will achieve what seasoned commanders who had spent their entire lives studying warfare called impossible by every measure. What military science developed over centuries said could not happen under any circumstances. What even God himself seemed to have forbidden through the natural laws governing combat between unequal forces. Think carefully about those numbers again and let them sink into your understanding. 500 knights against 26,000 professional warriors. The fate of Christian civilization in the Holy Land where Jesus himself had walked, perhaps in Europe itself, across the Mediterranean hangs by a thread so thin it is invisible to the naked eye and could snap at any moment. By sunset, on this day that will be remembered for centuries, that fragile thread will become an iron chain that binds the pages of history. What you are about to discover will reveal 3 things that will change forever how you see medieval warfare and the relationship between courage and mathematics. First, the tactical mistakes that Saladin made that no historian predicted based on his previous brilliant campaigns. Second, why elite Mamluk warriors, who had never known defeat in their professional military careers, fled the battlefield on racing camels in complete panic. Third, the precise moment when Baldwin IV, a leper king who could not even feel his own hands due to nerve damage, raised a sword that should not have been possible for him to grip, given his condition, and changed the course of history through sheer force of will. But here is what the chronicles written by monks do not tell you about that morning when the armies assembled. Baldwin IV was not supposed to be alive at this point. much less leading an army into battle against overwhelming odds. Leprosy had been eating away at his body systematically since childhood, when the first symptoms appeared. By 16 years of age, his hands were so damaged from the disease that they needed to be wrapped constantly in silk bandages just to prevent them from literally falling apart as the flesh rotted. His face hidden behind a silver mask, specially crafted, concealed features so ravaged by the progressive disease that courtiers who served him could not look at them directly without flinching in horror. Physicians who examined him regularly had given him months to live 3 years ago, based on the progression of his symptoms. Every morning that he woke up breathing was a medical impossibility that defied their understanding. Every time he mounted a horse to ride was an act of pure will that defied physical reality and the limitations of his decaying body. Facing him across the field stood Saladin, known throughout the Muslim world as the Sword of Islam, a man who had united the fractured Muslim territories through a combination of military genius demonstrated in numerous campaigns and genuine piety that inspired loyalty. At 40 years of age, he commanded an empire stretching from the Nile River in Egypt to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. His treasury held the accumulated wealth of Egypt collected through taxes. His armies had crushed every Christian force sent against them in recent years. His reputation alone had caused entire garrisons to surrender without firing a single arrow when his banners appeared on the horizon. While Baldwin fought desperately against his own decaying flesh that betrayed him daily, Saladin commanded over 100,000 warriors scattered across his vast territories. The power dynamic was not just lopsided in favor of the Muslims. It was laughable to anyone who understood military mathematics. Jerusalem itself was preparing for the inevitable end that seemed certain. Ships waited in the harbors of Acre and Tyre, loaded with the precious possessions of nobles who knew what was coming and wanted to preserve their wealth. Secret negotiations were already underway through intermediaries with Muslim commanders about the terms of surrender that might preserve some lives. The smart money among those who gambled on such things said the kingdom of Jerusalem had weeks remaining, maybe only days before it fell. The total Crusader forces across all their scattered territories could muster perhaps 15,000 men if every castle and city contributed, but they were scattered across dozens of fortifications. Saladin's current army alone, this force of 26,000 warriors, was nearly double everything the Christians could theoretically field if they abandoned all their defensive positions. And this was not even his main force or the full strength he could summon. Here's the reality that faced everyone that November morning when the sun rose. Baldwin could scrape together only 500 knights after calling in every favor, including just 80 Knights Templar who wore the distinctive white mantles with red crosses. Those warrior monks who took sacred vows to never retreat from battle, never surrender to Muslim forces, never show mercy to Islam's armies in combat. Supporting them were barely 3,000 infantry, many of them local levies recruited from farms and villages, who were armed with little more than farm tools and desperate courage, born of protecting their homes. Against them, arrayed across the plain, Saladin had brought 8,000 elite Mamluk cavalry slave soldiers who had been purchased as children and trained from their earliest years to be perfect killing machines who knew nothing but warfare. But as autumn turned gradually to winter in 1177 intelligence reports, brought by scouts riding exhausted horses, brought news that would force the dying king to attempt the impossible rather than accept defeat. Inside Jerusalem's throne room, where decisions of state were made, the war council had devolved into barely controlled panic that threatened to become open despair. Baldwin, who could no longer walk unassisted, had to be carried in on a litter by 4 strong men, his legs no longer able to support even his diminished weight after years of disease. The November cold that should have provided relief from summer heat instead sent spasms of pure agony through his diseased nerves that fired randomly. Every night in that stone chamber knew exactly what the scouts had reported from their dangerous reconnaissance missions. Saladin's 26,000 warriors were moving north steadily from Ascalon, bypassing the fortress there, entirely heading straight for Jerusalem, which lay nearly defenseless. The city's garrison numbered fewer than 1,000 men capable of fighting. Most were old veterans, past their prime young boys, not yet trained or wounded soldiers recovering from previous battles. The arithmetic was simple murder that admitted no hope. Raymond of Tripoli, the kingdom's most experienced commander, who had survived decades of warfare, spoke aloud what everyone in the room was thinking, but feared to say. "My lord, you must flee immediately to Tyre, where the harbor offers escape. The kingdom needs its king alive to negotiate terms, not dead in a hopeless stand that accomplishes nothing." Others nodded their agreement with this sensible counsel that preserved at least something. Gerard de Ridefort suggested that terms of surrender might still be negotiated through intermediaries if they acted quickly. Even Reynold of H. Tillon, that savage warrior who had never counseled retreat in his entire violent life, remained silent in the face of overwhelming odds. The situation was that desperate and hopeless to all observers. Then Baldwin did something that stunned even his closest advisors, who thought they knew him. Despite hands that could barely close into fists, despite a body that screamed with agony, at every movement he demanded to be lifted to a sitting position on his litter. His voice, when it came, was clear and carried authority to every corner of that stone chamber, despite his physical weakness. "Gentlemen, I may die tomorrow when we meet the enemy, or in 10 years from this disease, but I will die as I have lived since taking the throne, defending this kingdom against all who threaten it. God gave me this terrible disease for a purpose that I have long struggled to understand. When we achieve victory in the coming battle, no man can claim it was accomplished by human strength alone, working without divine aid." The room erupted in shocked voices. Victory had the disease finally reached his mind and driven him mad. Odo de Saint Amand, Grand Master of the Knights Templar and commander of the warrior monks, was the first to understand what Baldwin meant. His Knights Templar had taken sacred vows before God to die in battle, rather than retreat from Muslim forces. If a dying boy ravaged by disease could face certain annihilation with faith in divine providence, how could they who were healthy do any less without shame? One by one, around the chamber, the knights began to kneel, not in submission to authority, but in something far more powerful that transcended mere obedience, which was genuine belief in their cause. What happened next in the hours that followed defied every principle of military logic that had been established over centuries. Instead of preparing Jerusalem's defenses for the siege that was coming, Baldwin ordered an immediate march, not away from Saladin's approaching host to seek safety, but directly toward it to engage in open battle. The knights would leave within the hour, taking every single man who could hold a weapon and sit on a horse. The insanity of the plan was breathtaking to anyone who understood warfare. March exhausted forces 45 miles through hostile territory controlled by enemy scouts to attack an enemy that outnumbered them 50 to 1 in open battle. Here is what military historians Studying this campaign still cannot explain adequately centuries later. The march that followed over the next day and night should have killed half the force from exhaustion before they ever saw the enemy on any battlefield. 45 miles covered in 36 hours of brutal, forced marching. Men in full armor that weighed 70 pounds, already exhausted from weeks of constant alerts and patrols. Horses pushed far beyond normal endurance that would break most animals. The November heat, unseasonably brutal for late autumn, turned the dusty road into a furnace that cooked men inside their metal shells. Nights began collapsing after hour 10 of continuous marching without proper rest. By hour 20, when night had fallen and risen again, men were hallucinating from severe dehydration and exhaustion that made them see things. The Knights Templar took turns carrying Baldwin's litter when he lost consciousness from overwhelming pain, which happened every few miles as his body gave out. Blood seeped through his bandages from wounds that refused to heal due to his compromised condition. At one point, near the village of Ibelin, witnesses who survived reported seeing the king's body convulsing so violently that 4 strong knights had to hold him down to prevent injury. Yet when he regained consciousness after these episodes, his first words were always the same without variation: continue the march toward the enemy. Meanwhile, miles away, Saladin had made the fatal decision that would cost him everything he had built. Completely confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority that made defeat seem impossible, he had allowed his army to scatter across 3 miles of countryside to forage for supplies. Foraging parties roamed freely without concern. Discipline relaxed throughout the camp. His scouts had reported Jerusalem's walls barely manned by skeleton crews. Why maintain strict battle formation when marching to what seemed like an execution of a dying kingdom? His emirs, who commanded various units, were already dividing up the conquered lands among themselves, arguing over who would get the richest estates and most productive farm. The Sultan himself had brought his entire treasury with him, planning not a battle that would require payment afterward, but an occupation that would establish permanent control. By dawn, on November 25th, Baldwin's impossible march had covered ground that maps said could not be crossed in that time by any force. Scouts riding ahead brought electrifying news back to the exhausted column. Saladin's army was not formed for battle in defensive positions. They were scattered, carelessly relaxed, without concern, completely unprepared for any threat. God had delivered them exactly as Baldwin had prophesied with absolute certainty. 25th dawned clear and hot across the Palestinian plain, and Saladin's scouts had made a mistake that would cost 20,000 lives before sunset. 6 o'clock in the morning brought the first gift from God, or perhaps from Baldwin's tactical genius that had studied terrain carefully, depending on your perspective. The king's scouts, Turcopoles, who were local Christians, who knew this land like their own skin after generations, returned with news that made even exhausted knights who could barely stand straighten their back. Saladin's mighty host was not arranged for battle in proper formations. They were scattered carelessly across 3 miles of rolling countryside, foraging parties, spreading out like fingers from a careless hand reaching for food. Supply wagons sat unguarded near the camp center. Horse lines were dispersed across wide areas to find grazing. The Muslim army looked less like a military force ready for combat and more like a migration of peaceful travelers. The Templar Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand rode his horse directly to Baldwin's litter, where the king rested. "Sire, God has delivered them into our hands for destruction. But even this hardened warrior could not hide the fear creeping into his voice when he added the next part of his report. The enemy numbers are worse than we thought based on earlier estimates. Not 20,000 as reported, but 26,000 warriors. Their banners darken the entire horizon in every direction. Some knights openly wept at this news that made the odds even worse. Others fell to their knees in prayer, asking for divine intervention. 52 to 1, the mathematics had become even more impossible than before. At 11 o'clock that morning, Saladin received his first warning that something was wrong. Dust clouds to the north, moving fast toward his position. His initial reaction, recorded faithfully by the chronicler Ibn al-Athir, was complete disbelief that Christians would be so foolish. His scouts had confirmed with certainty that Jerusalem's walls were barely manned by defenders. Baldwin would not dare leave their protection to engage in open battle. It had to be a scouting party, perhaps raiders hoping to harass his supply lines as they had done before. He sent orders for just a few squadrons to investigate the matter, nothing more than a routine patrol. This overconfidence that victory was assured would haunt him forever afterward. By noon, when the sun reached its peak, the terrible truth became undeniable to all observers. Crusader banners appeared on the ridgeline, overlooking the scattered Muslim camp. Not scout pennants fluttering in wind, but the great war standards of major forces, including the blood-red cross of the Knights Templar, the golden crosses of Jerusalem, representing the kingdom, the personal banner of Baldwin IV himself, that everyone recognized. Saladin's scattered forces began frantically trying to reform their lines for battle, but 3 miles is an eternity when your enemy is already formed and ready to strike. Commands shouted in Arabic, and Turkish and Kurdish crashed into each other as officers tried desperately to organize the chaos spreading through camp. Here is where legend meets reality in the historical account. Military logic demanded that Baldwin wait patiently. Let Saladin organize his forces into proper formations, then retreat to defensible ground that favored the defenders. Draw them into prepared positions that negated numerical advantage. Use the terrain to multiply defensive strength. Every manual of war written over centuries, every precedent of battle studied by commanders, said the same thing without variation. Never charge a superior force on open ground where they can surround you. Never attack when outnumbered by such margin. Never gamble everything on a single moment that cannot be taken back. Baldwin was about to violate every single one of these established rules that had kept armies alive. Despite agony that would have killed most men outright from shock, the leper king demanded to be lifted from his litter and placed on his war horse for battle. Knights rushed forward to strap him to the saddle, carefully, his useless legs dangling his hands, barely able to grip the leather reins, even with help. Blood seeped through his silk bandages, where the straps cut into diseased flesh that had no feeling. Yet, when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the entire Christian line assembled for battle. Gentleman David faced Goliath with nothing but faith in God. We faced 26,000 warriors with the same faith that moved mountains. The Muslim army's reaction tells us everything about their shock at what they witnessed. Elite Mamluks, warriors who had faced Byzantine cataphracts and Nubian cavalry without flinching even once, simply froze in place. For precious seconds that would cost them dearly, they could not process what they were seeing before their eyes. 500 knights forming a charge formation against 26,000 warriors was not warfare as they understood it. It was mass suicide that made no tactical sense. Saladin himself, watching from his command position on a small hill, dropped his golden mace in shock. The greatest military commander of the age, who had never lost a major battle, could not comprehend the insanity unfolding before his experienced eyes. Then Baldwin noticed something that Saladin had missed in his confidence. The seemingly flat plains were cut by a series of ravines, invisible from distance to untrained eyes, but deadly for fleeing cavalry who might stumble into them. What looked like open ground was actually terrain that would funnel retreating men into natural killing grounds where escape would be impossible. The young king had recognized what Saladin's experience had overlooked in his assumption of easy victory. Those ravines would become channels of death for thousands. Madness, Saladin whispered to himself, then louder to his panicking officers rushing around him. Form lines immediately. Form defensive lines now. But forming proper battle lines from scattered foraging parties takes precious time that cannot be rushed. Time that Baldwin was not going to give them under any circumstances. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the leper king raised his bandaged hand, wrapped in silk, the signal his knights had been praying to receive. 500 lances, dropped simultaneously to charging position, pointed at the enemy. At exactly 2 o'clock on that fateful afternoon, Baldwin raised his bandaged hand that should not have been able to move, and 500 men began charging toward 26,000 warriors spread across the plain. 2 o'clock struck like the hammer of God himself, according to witnesses. The Templar wedge, formed of 80 knights, organized into a human spear, smashed into the half-formed Muslim center at full gallop of war horses, running at maximum speed. The sound was like mountains colliding in an earthquake that shook the earth, a crash that men 5 miles away in distant villages claimed they heard clearly. In those first seconds of impact, 300 Mamluks simply ceased to exist as living beings, crushed under iron-shod hooves, weighing tons, or transfixed by 12-foot ashwood lances that punched through mail and flesh like parchment soaked in water. But the real shock was not the devastating impact that killed hundreds. It was what followed immediately after. Instead of wheeling away after the initial charge, as was standard cavalry doctrine taught in every army, the Templars did the unthinkable that violated all training. They kept going forward, driving deeper into Muslim ranks, like a blade seeking a heart to pierce. Behind them, in a second wave, Baldwin's 420 secular knights struck hard, exploiting the gap torn by the warrior monks. The charge covered 300 yards in under a minute of time. 500 ironclad horsemen moving like an avalanche down a mountain. The battle cry of Deus Vult, meaning God wills it, drowning out Muslim commanders' desperate orders to form ranks. At 500 yards distance, Muslim arrows began falling like rain from the sky. Knights fell from saddles' horses, screamed and tumbled breaking legs, but the charge never wavered or slowed for an instant. At 200 yards, the full terror of what was coming became absolutely clear to the Muslim front ranks watching. These were not just knights following orders. They were fanatics who believed completely. Men who believed that death in battle guaranteed immediate paradise. The Templars, especially with their black and white banner streaming overhead in wind, came on like demons from Christian hell itself. 2:15 in the afternoon brought the first impossible moment that defied explanation. Saladin's center formation of 8,000 of Islam's finest cavalry began to buckle under pressure. Not retreat in good order, but buckle like metal under stress. Like a dam cracking under water pressure, it was never designed to withstand. The Muslim commanders watching could not believe their eyes or trust their vision. How could 500 exhausted knights be pushing back 16 times their number in disciplined formations? The physics did not work according to any laws. The mathematics were absolutely impossible. Yet it was happening right before them. Then something occurred that defied all military logic established over centuries. The Crusader horses, exhausted from their brutal forced march, should have been failing and collapsing. Instead, they fought like creatures possessed by spirit. War horses bred for combat bit and kicked viciously, adding to the carnage being inflicted. One Templar mount, whose rider had been killed, continued charging through Muslim ranks on its own, trampling warriors and spreading panic by its very existence without a rider. The beast finally collapsed after taking 17 arrows in its body, but not before its rampage had broken an entire squadron's formation. 2:30 in the afternoon saw panic begin its deadly work through the Muslim rank. A Mamluk regiment positioned on Saladin's left wing, seeing the center collapse before their eyes, began edging backward slowly. In battle where morale matters, hesitation is contagious, like disease. Within minutes, the backward drift became a stream of men fleeing. Commands became screams of desperation. Formation dissolved into chaos that spread. The impossible was happening against all odds. 26,000 warriors were being routed by a force they outnumbered 52 to 1. But then came Baldwin's master stroke that he had planned carefully. His 3,000 infantry, hidden in dead ground during the cavalry charge, where they could not be seen, suddenly appeared on the Muslim flank like ghosts. The psychological impact was devastating beyond measure. To Saladin's already rattled forces, it seemed Crusader armies were materializing from nowhere, like sorcery. Shouts of "We are surrounded" spread through Muslim ranks like wildfire. Militarily, this was nonsense, since they still outnumbered the Christians. But panic does not calculate odds rationally. Baldwin himself, strapped to his saddle, bleeding from stress that reopened wounds, raised his sword high. The gesture was medically impossible given his condition. His diseased hands should not have been able to grip the weapon at all. Yet every chronicle written afterward, both Christian and Muslim alike, records this moment. The Leper King was leading from the front despite his dying body. At 50 yards distance, Muslim horses began backing despite their riders' frantic effort. Animals sensed doom approaching, and doom was mere seconds away. The ground literally shook under thousands of hooves pounding. Dust clouds rose like smoke from fires. The noise was indescribable to those who survived. Thunder mixed with war cries in 3 different languages. The clash of weapons being readied for combat. Prayers screamed desperately to 2 different gods for protection. Muslim arrows darkened the sky in volleys, but the Crusaders came on without stopping. Unstoppable as fate, inevitable as death, terrifying beyond description. 2:45 marked the moment when battle became massacre that would be remembered. As Muslim forces tried desperately to flee the field, they discovered Baldwin's tactical genius with terrain. Those ravines that looked like escape routes became death traps with no exit. Knights pursued fleeing Muslims straight into these natural killing grounds where thousands died. But then, at 3 o'clock, something happened that even Muslim chroniclers called divine punishment for sins. 3 o'clock brought the unthinkable that shocked both armies. Saladin's personal guard of 2,000 Mamluks, who had sworn sacred oaths to die before abandoning their sultan, broke and ran. These were men who had faced Mongol cavalry without flinching even once, who wore their battle scars like holy relics, proving valor. Yet faced with Templars who fought like men seeing paradise before them, they ran in complete panic. The sight shattered what remained of Muslim morale across the field. If the elite guard fled, what hope did common soldiers have against such enemies? Saladin himself, watching his invincible army disintegrate before his eyes, made a decision that would haunt him forever in nightmares. Abandoning his warhorse as too slow for escape, he mounted a racing camel used for fast travel. The sight of their sultan, fleeing on a pack animal, destroyed the last vestiges of Muslim resistance. His golden armor glinted in the afternoon sun as he disappeared into the dust clouds, leaving behind an army that had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 330 saw pursuit become systematic annihilation that was merciless. Crusader knights, with their blood up from victory, chased fleeing Muslims for miles across the countryside. The killing was mechanical, efficient, and horrible beyond words. Lances broken in the charge, they used swords. Swords blunted from use, they used maces. Some Templars who had lost all weapons beat enemies to death with their own helmets. The very ground became slippery with blood, making footing treacherous. Those ravines Baldwin had identified became charnel houses of death. Muslims fell in layers, the dead cushioning the dying, suffocating under more dead piling on top. Some ravines literally filled with bodies, creating bridges of flesh that others tried to cross. Modern historians studying the battlefield still cannot explain this part adequately. How did 500 exhausted knights maintain pursuit for 2 hours without rest? How did horses near death from the march find strength to run down fresh Muslim cavalry? The Christian chroniclers, writing in monasteries, had an answer they believed. God's strength flowed through them supernaturally. The Muslim chroniclers, horrified by the defeat, agreed this was divine punishment for their sins. Ibn al-Ayr wrote that Allah had turned his face from them that day in judgment. 4 o'clock brought scenes that haunt the historical records. The pursuit only ended when Crusader horses finally collapsed completely, their mighty hearts giving out after achieving the impossible through superhuman effort. Baldwin himself had fought despite agony that defies description by any words. Knights who survived later swore under oath they saw tears of blood seeping from beneath his silver mask, his diseased body literally weeping from the physical effort. Yet his voice never wavered, once calling encouragement to his men, directing the slaughter with tactical brilliance that amazed observers. By 4:30, Muslim dead carpeted the field for 3 miles in every direction. Bodies clogged the ravines 20 feet deep in places. Abandoned weapons littered the ground like iron seeds planted for harvest. The streaming banners of Islam's greatest army lay trampled in mud made from dust and blood. The numbers stagger the mind, even now, centuries later. Of 26,000 warriors who woke that morning, confident fewer than 2,000 saw sunset alive. 20,000 Muslim dead lay where they fell. The Crusaders lost 100 men total, heavy losses from just 3,500 engaged in battle. But nothing compared to the Islamic catastrophe that destroyed an army. The immediate material gains defied calculation by treasurers. Saladin's army had carried wealth to sustain a long campaign. Gold coins, horses, supplies for 26,000 men for months. In 3 hours, it all became Crusader property through right of conquest. The Knights Templar alone captured enough military equipment to outfit every Christian fortress in the Levant. More importantly, for the struggling kingdom, they captured Saladin's war chest intact, literal tons of gold meant to pay his army for months. In one afternoon of battle, the bankrupt kingdom of Jerusalem became financially solvent. Baldwin, finally allowing himself to be lifted from his horse, collapsed immediately unconscious. Knights rushed to support their dying king, but he waved them away weakly, insisting on one final act before rest. There on that field of death, covered with 20,000 corpses, the leper king led his exhausted army in prayer. Non nobis Domine, not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory for this victory. The sight of 500 blood-soaked killers kneeling in prayer while surrounded by 20,000 corpses struck even hardened warriors as surreal beyond word. Saladin's humiliation was complete and total. The man who had never known defeat in his career arrived in Cairo with fewer than 2,000 survivors from 26,000. His racing camel had saved his life, but destroyed his reputation forever. Warriors who flee on pack animals do not inspire loyalty from followers. As the sun set on that blood-soaked field, the impossible had become history that would be written. The strategic implications were staggering for both sides. Saladin's power base in Egypt nearly collapsed from the defeat. Syria questioned their allegiance to a defeated sultan. The careful alliance he had built over decades cracked in a single afternoon. Military historians calculate it took Saladin 10 years to rebuild a force comparable to what Baldwin destroyed in 3 hours. The Crusader states, granted this miraculous reprieve, gained time they had never dared hope for. Time to fortify positions, time to negotiate alliances, time to summon help from Europe. The Muslim chronicler, Ibn al-Athir, usually sympathetic to Islamic causes, could not hide the scope of the disaster. He called it the most terrible catastrophe to befall Islam in this age. Another chronicler wrote simply, God turned his face from us that day in judgment. The psychological impact on the Muslim world was devastating and lasted years. If 26,000 could not defeat 500 Christians, what did that say about divine favor mosques from Cairo to Damascus, filled with believers seeking answers from scholars? Some blamed sin, others questioned faith itself in ways that troubled authorities. Jerusalem erupted in celebration when news arrived days later. Church bells rang for 3 days straight without stopping. But in the royal chamber, Baldwin IV lay dying from his exertions. The battle's physical toll on his ravaged body was catastrophic, according to physicians. Doctors warned he might not survive the night after such strain. Yet somehow, impossibly, the leper king endured and lived. When asked how he had found strength to fight, Baldwin whispered through damaged lips, "Pain means nothing when God requires service from his servant." For 10 years, after that bloody November day, Saladin approached the Crusader states with newfound caution born of respect. The man who had swept all before him had learned that numbers alone do not guarantee victory, not when facing an enemy willing to die for their cause without hesitation.